Hi everyone, thanks for coming to this webinar today. Going to give it just a few more seconds because I can see the numbers ticking up as people arrive. Okay, well, let's make a start. So thanks everyone for coming. Hi there in Halifax, Canada. Thanks for that. Um, so my name is Amy Hall, and I am a co-editor at New Internationalist magazine. And at a time when global conflict is increasing, nuclear armed states are adding fuel to the fire by reaffirming their commitments to nuclear weapons and abandoning arms control agreements. Last month, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists set its doomsday clock, a model that looks at how close we are to destroying our world, to 85 seconds to midnight, which is the closest it's ever been. The threat of nuclear war is very much back on the agenda, back on the international news headlines. And the US has a pivotal role to play in the escalation of tensions, with ramifications far beyond its borders. And that's what we're going to be discussing today, along with an exciting international panel of speakers. So, due to the time difference, we'll be joined via pre-recorded video by Dae-Han, who is based in South Korea. He is part of the International Strategy Center, which is a source of information about the Korean Peninsula, which draws in lessons and perspectives from around the world. And he is also part of the No Cold War Collective, an international coalition, and an associate with the Korea Policy Institute, which is based in the US. And we'll be publishing my full interview with Dae-Han as part of our podcast, The World Unspun, in the coming weeks. So you won't hear so much from him tonight, but there's plenty more to come. And joining us live, we have Sophie Bolt, who is the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. She has over 30 years campaigning experience and has been part of CND's leadership for over 2 decades. Ludo de Brabander is a Belgian peace activist, author, and spokesperson for Vrede, which means peace. And he is council member of the International Peace Bureau and member of the International Coordination Committee of No to War, No to NATO. And finally, thank you so much to Ivana Hughes, president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and a senior lecturer in chemistry at Columbia University, who joined us just a few days ago after Helen Jacquard was unfortunately unable to make it due to unforeseen circumstances. So thank you so much for all of you for joining us today. We're coming from 3 different countries, and I know that our audience will also be coming from multiple places. So yeah, it's really nice to have everyone here today. But before I start, I also wanted to say thank you to CND for hosting this event with us. And for those who don't know, New Internationalist is an independent, cooperatively run media organization owned by our workers and over 4,600 of our readers around the world. And our latest magazine is about the new nuclear arms race, exploring what we can do to push for disarmament, with reports from the world's nuclear front lines, including how survivors of French nuclear testing in the Sahara are still fighting for justice decades later, how the British state spied on the nuclear disarmament movement, the preppers planning to ride out nuclear war in luxury, or not, as the case may be, and how we can still abolish nuclear weapons in today's insecure world. And of course, as a truly independent media organization, we rely on our readers to keep producing our global journalism. So if you subscribe to the magazine after today's event, you will get a free copy of the nuclear weapons issue. And my colleague Rod, who is helping us out today, along with Maxine, will share the details of the offer in the chat. So we will have some time for questions later from the audience. There is a Q&A box which you can stick your questions in. I've just seen a message saying that the chat's disabled, so I will try and address that, or one of my colleagues will. But I'm going to start now with the discussion. So my first kind of a question is to everyone, and maybe I'll start with you, Sophie, is one of the things that kind of struck me while I was working on our nuclear weapons magazine is how normalized their existence is as necessary for security. Kind of in the media and in political kind of conversations. So what are the factors that perpetuate this kind of normalization in politics and in the media, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, and also massive thanks to New Internationalist. We're really excited to be jointly organising this. It's really great. And also, I think answering this question, I feel that it shows why independent investigative journalism is just so critical because, you're absolutely right. If you kind of look in the media, overwhelmingly, there's very little kind of challenge to the nuclear dangers, the costs, and also the kind of constant risks associated with nuclear weapons. And of course, that's absolutely deliberate. I mean, governments have a very kind of clear policy to maintain nuclear secrecy. We sort of see that at, British bases. Or British bases that are hosting US nuclear weapons. Former sort of governments have brought in exemption certificates basically to make sure that nobody knows what's going on at, for instance, RAF Lakenheath, that now house US nuclear weapons. So, as I say, it's really important that we have like independent investigative journalism. When you do have that, it's able to kind of expose, all the nuclear accidents, the sort of radioactive leaks that are taking place at nuclear bases, certainly here in Britain. But I do think that it's becoming like much harder to justify them as necessary for our security. I think particularly when you look at the role that Donald Trump is playing. There's lots of challenge to Britain's military alliance with the Trump administration, and also the fact that Britain is so dependent on the US for its nuclear weapons. But also if you look at like public opinion, um, you know countries that don't have nuclear weapons, definitely don't want that. Like even in countries like Europe, across the board, there's sort of very clear majorities that they don't want to get nuclear weapons. And then, again, like looking at, countries, again, across Europe, there's really, really massive majority opposition to hosting US nuclear weapons in those countries. Really, really high majorities, including here in Britain, like 61%. And why is that? Populations completely understand that they are really, really dangerous. They make us a target, and they offer no protection. So I think more and more we're seeing this kind of disconnect in terms of how nuclear weapons are kind of represented by, political leaderships and the media compared to what people genuinely think. They rightly understand that they are a huge threat and they don't protect us.
Thanks, Sophie. Ludo, can I just come to you to see what your thoughts are on this?
Yes, I agree with what Sophie said, but I think also there is a wide belief in the idea of nuclear deterrence. I think, and that during the Cold War, that it remained cold and not an open war in Europe due to the fact that we have nuclear weapons. Although I think the history shows that we nearly escaped several times, I think, an open nuclear war. I refer, for example, in 1983, the Russian officer or Soviet officer, Stanislav Petrov, who there's a documentary about him, the man who saved the world, because it was due only to his intuition that he thought there was a false alarm, and he didn't launch, let's say, the procedure to have a counter strike to something he saw on his screens, radar screens, or in his communication. So I think, but it's a widely believed, I think, and it's mainly believed in what I would call not only the military industrial complex, but media and academic complex. So to complete that sentence of media, industrial, academic, and media complex. So and if you look to these circles, then you see there's this widely belief in deterrence. And deterrence, the weak thing of it is that it supposes rational leadership. And when we see now leaders like Trump, I think with Trump you cannot trust in rational leadership and as a base for deterrence. So that's and I think as a peace movement, you should always emphasize that, that deterrence is not working with this kind of leaderships, and it's not working also with the technological evolutions we see, the hypersonic missiles, for example. You launch a missile and while you detect them, they explode already. So there is not really there's not even a chance of responding it, which is also supposed as a base, I thinking in deterrence. And last but not least, I think, of course, it's connected to the general militarization we are witnessing now in the geopolitical context. And nuclear arms are like considered as part of it. But it's true. I saw it through the chat box. Somebody said there is nuclear arms, unfortunately, disappeared from the political and the media agenda. And I hope this can soon come back, but not for negative reasons, hopefully. But it's true. It's like nuclear weapons are absent. If you compare it, for example, with the huge debate that we had in political circles and in the media, it was front page topics, nuclear arms in the 80s. And that was the reason why it created this mass mobilization, this consciousness and awareness among people. So, but I think it's true. There's a kind of normalization, but with what is happening now and the trends, hopefully the consciousness among people can make it that we cannot trust anymore this normalization of nuclear weapons. I see Sophie
Yeah,
disappeared.
we've lost Sophie, but hopefully she will make it back soon. Ivana, did you have any thoughts on this idea of how nuclear weapons have been kind of normalized?
Absolutely. And I really appreciate, first of all, really appreciate being a part of this panel and really appreciate Sophie's and Ludo's introductory remarks. And I agree with much of it. I think I'm a little bit more with Ludo in terms of, yes, the general public, if and when they're aware of the problem, they can very easily identify nuclear weapons as the problem. But I think most people, certainly in the United States, just quite simply appear to be asleep at the wheel. And I think we really have this very sharp divide between that general public awareness during the Cold War and then what's happened since the end of the Cold War. Of course, some of it was due to the fact that at the end of the Cold War, we actually did make huge strides on disarmament. In 1986, there were 70,000 nuclear warheads. Today, we have 12,500. That's a huge success. It's still 12,500 too many. But some of the complacency is due to the fact that nuclear disarmament was actually happening. And some of the complacency is really due to this notion simultaneously as we sort of lost the Cold War kind of argument of why you needed nuclear weapons. And yet, and I would just add to Ludo's excellent observation that it's not just the military-industrial complex, it's media, it's academia, it's Hollywood, it's, in the United States, it's Congress. There's a fantastic book by Bill Hartung and Ben Freeman, which was published at the end of last year, called The $1 Trillion War Machine. It is just mind-boggling and unfathomable what a real, machine across all these sectors this really is. And so you sort of needed a reason to keep nuclear weapons. And it's not that nuclear deterrence is new or that it didn't exist during the Cold War. It's just that the narrative of nuclear weapons keep us safe has really penetrated society in very significant and deep ways. And at the same time, that narrative is so unsustainable with respect to non-proliferation efforts. So when you point your fingers and say Iran shouldn't acquire nuclear weapons, or it's horrible that North Korea has nuclear weapons, when you do that and at the same time say, but we need our nuclear weapons for our safety, security, to keep the peace and so on, the whole thing is just built on the house of cards. It's just not an argument that is actually sustainable, which is why we do see these non-proliferation challenges. And it's even no longer just about perhaps states that, let's say, might worry about regime change, but it's also something that's being promoted in the West as, oh, Japan should get nuclear weapons, and Canada should get nuclear weapons, and Germany should get nuclear weapons. I mean, this is from articles written by quote unquote serious analysts, right? Openly discussing proliferation of nuclear weapons, which in some sense is the logical conclusion if you buy into the argument that nuclear weapons keep you safe. But of course, it's also simultaneously completely preposterous because if nuclear weapons keep you safe, then everybody should have nuclear weapons. And then, of course, we're going to destroy this beautiful planet of ours, far, far faster than we can even imagine. So I'll keep it at that and maybe add more thoughts in answer to further questions.
Thank you. And yeah, you both kind of talked about the Cold War era and how things have changed. And Sophie, I'm glad you're back. So obviously the movement again, like for nuclear disarmament is something that many people associate with the Cold War era. Can you talk a little bit about what the movement looks like today and maybe a bit about how it's evolved and why we need it now more than ever?
Yeah, sorry about that. I my laptop crashed.
It's okay. These things happen. It's
Yeah,
Zoom.
it always happens. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly from CND's point of view, CND has always been very much sort of like part of a kind of the wider peace movement, the sort of the wider anti-war movement. And, it's always been sort of very reactive to, the global dynamics of the world that we live in. And certainly now, we continue to be very like proactively campaigning against wars because it's wars where the threat of nuclear weapons is gonna happen, isn't it? So we've been sort of centrally involved in the movement against the Iraq War, and now we're very centrally involved in the Palestine coalition against the genocide being carried out by nuclear armed Israel, and we see it as being really critical to be part of this kind of wider movement for an alternative to war, nuclear weapons and the consequences of them, and it's very important, like we sort of see this as kind of central to be sort of arguing that nuclear weapons aren't something that's abstract, they're not some just technical piece of kit, and that they affect people's lives every day and all the time. So very much in relation to the economic choices of our governments that are driving poverty. So we, campaign strongly for, nurses, not nukes. We should be spending money on, saving lives, not destroying them. Looking at how like carbon emissions and spending on war is massively accelerating, climate breakdown. You can't bomb your way out the climate crisis. And also we're very much now part of a new alliance here in Britain, campaigning against the rise of the far right, which is, very, very sort of serious threat. Obviously, we're seeing this across Europe as well. We're kind of arguing, rightly so, that, racism totally dehumanizes people. It helps, create these enemies to sort of justify wars. And our view is that we have got to, if we're going to mobilize the majority of the population against nuclear weapons, we have to show how getting rid of them will impact people's lives now. The relevance, the sort of centrality of nuclear disarmament, now. So that's kind of what we're about. We're very much understanding that we're totally part of a much sort of wider movement, but also how, these crises are totally interconnected. The solutions are the same. And so it's absolutely critical that we're kind of part of all of those interconnected movements.
Great, thank you, Sophie. And I'm going to move on now just to hear a little bit from Dae-Han Song. So he wrote for us in the Nuclear Weapons magazine, making the argument that in order to rid the world of nuclear weapons, we first need a global common security, and that's an essential step basically towards states giving up nuclear weapons or the pursuit of nuclear weapons. And so I asked him to explain a little bit about what he meant by common security and what we are up against.
Common security means that my security or that the security of one country is not to the detriment of the security of another country. Because when that happens, you're not actually achieving security, right? You have one country that, for example, like if NATO keeps expanding, perhaps like Europeans might say, hey, NATO is expanding. Like it's actually, we're becoming more powerful, right? It's giving us more security. But in fact, what it's doing is it's making somebody else feel threatened. And when somebody else feels threatened, then that's gonna, like, of course, it's gonna infringe on the security, right? There is no security without having, there is no real stable security without having security for everyone, right? And I think that the approach of the United States so far has been that it's security at the cost of other people's security, at the cost of other countries' security, right? And of course, before in the past, when the United States was massively dominant, perhaps it could get away with that. But that is no longer the case, right? The US is dominant, but it doesn't have like an absolute dominance, right?
Thanks. And now I'm going to just move to asking all of you a bit more about the US, because obviously that's kind of what we're discussing today. And whether you think that we've seen an increase in US warmongering in Donald Trump's second stint as president, or if it's just the kind of same old US imperialism, but just with a more brash delivery. And then also what that means for the threat of nuclear war in particular. And I asked this question to Dae-Han Song as well. So I'll start with his answer and then maybe can hear from the rest of you on what you think and maybe also reflecting on what he's said. So I'm going to ask Rod to play the next clip from him.
I think it has like qualitatively shifted. It's like qualitatively escalated. I mean, it'd be naive to say that everything started with Trump, which it didn't, like all the killing, like bombings, stuff like that was happening previously with with other presidents as well. But it's the first time that the United States like bullying allies, like bullying and laughing at them. It's like crude and grotesque, right? Uh, I remember, I forget the guy that's in charge, the trade representative for the United States. Uh, there was a time when South Korean diplomats were trying to have a meeting with him, and in effect, they kept flying, like they kept chasing after him, right? And then on television, he laughs about this, right? It's like a lot of these, and this might just seem like crude behavior, but I think it speaks to uh, a certain level of like we don't have to wear the mask anymore. We don't have to even pretend with niceties, and I think that matters. You know, um, like I don't think any other president would have kidnapped a head of state like in Venezuela. That's just, I mean, I couldn't even imagine that when that happened. I was just like, what is going on in the world, right? Uh, that is qualitatively different. I would say when the wolf has become the most dangerous because the wolf is wounded, right? And it's just like snarling at everybody. And that's where we are. There's a great publication by the Tricontinental that talks about hyper-imperialism. It predicted this like last year, right? It said that the US is entering a hyper-imperialist phase, and that is what Trump represents. And of course, that's, like the fascism that is growing in the United States. That's just the flip side of it, right? It's not like there is no connection between this kind of like white supremacist attitude that is growing in the United States and its foreign policy is completely connected, right? And one feeds the other, right? And of course, this is not to say that the Democrats are so amazing. It's like the Democrats laid the ground for this, right? It was the Democratic Party with its inability to like to to have any significant reform to improve the lives of just like everyday Americans that led a lot of them to become towards Trump, right? Um, so I guess yes, I would say that we are at a qualitatively different time, and it just feels scary.
Thanks to the past Dae-Han song from last week. Ivana, I'm going to come to you next because obviously you're in the US, and I wondered what your thoughts are on Trump and kind of whether he is just kind of the same thing but with a different delivery or not.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. I think it's really the million-dollar question right now. I want to say something, and I hope I don't get misinterpreted here. I want to say something in the defense of the American people who, on the whole, voted for Donald Trump, not defense of, specifically his voters, but that was the outcome of our election. And I personally think that it really was an election that he won on two issues. One, the economic issues. He managed to present himself as the champion of the working class. How a billionaire with his, behaviors, tendencies, and so on succeeded at doing that, I think actually speaks more about the Democratic Party than about him. But nevertheless, that was, by and large, I think, an impression amongst those who voted for him. The second thing he managed somehow, again, to present himself as was the peace candidate. Donald Trump was the peace candidate in 2024. He was going to end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. He was going to, make sure that the Gaza war ends and will end it even before I come into office, and will, solve all of these problems. So I think part of what we're seeing is the American people, Obama won on a peace agenda too in 2008, and because he was one of the few senators who voted against the Iraq War. I mean, this is not the American people don't want more war. That is for sure. It's just that they end up getting stuck with these two choices that are, in some sense, two sides of the same coin. What I do think Trump has revealed himself since the election to be is it's not just that he's so erratic and that things change day to day. It's that the range of possible outcomes with him is so wide, wider than anything you could have kind of envisioned with another administration. And just to say about nuclear weapons, this is the same president that declared, we need to denuclearize, and said nuclear weapons cost too much and they could destroy the world over and over again. The same guy, multiple times, not just once, right? Talking about denuclearization. And then the same guy who refuses to even issue a formal response to Russia when Russia proposed that the New START treaty be extended for another year. He said something to the extent if it expires, it expires. Katrina vanden Heuvel from The Nation here in the US, wrote as if he were talking about a carton of milk, and not like the world's last arms control agreement between the two nuclear superpowers. So he's really all over the place, and on a day-to-day basis, he is so erratic that we quite simply, could, and on the very optimistic side, we could see some kind of movement towards well, nuclear disarmament. And at the same time, I could quite simply see him press the button or, continue with these sorts of actions and violations of international law that lead us right into a nuclear war. It's just supremely and extremely dangerous. Um, I'll just say that what really we have witnessed is, the on Ukraine, to the extent that the U.S. Is perhaps capable of helping to promote peace and negotiations and so on, he seems to care about what the person with whom he spoke last said to him. So even there, like that erratic nature seems to really matter. On Gaza and this board of peace, I mean, it's just like I don't even want to comment about how insane all of that seems. On Venezuela, of course, it came up already. I mean, it just, kidnapping a leader of a sovereign country. The threats on Greenland seems like those have subsided for the moment. But all of this is not doesn't just bode poorly for nuclear disarmament. It bodes poorly for just respect for international law, which ultimately is really the only way that we're going to address some very serious issues that we have on the planet, and specifically the threat of nuclear war.
Thanks, Ivana. And Ludo, what have you seen kind of in terms of the impact of Trump's current presidency, I guess particularly in Europe?
Well, I think, first of all, what I said is I agree with it. I think, first of all, there's a kind of structural continuity in let's say, US imperialism. Let's use that word. It's very obviously imperialism, or you can also call it Pax Americana. That's the policy. And it goes back to, after the Cold War, when Wolfowitz, remember when he was Vice Secretary of Defense, I think, he published the so-called Wolfowitz Doctrine, which was essentially about the purpose of foreign policy of US should be to be the unilateral power, dominant power, and not to tolerate competitive powers. And you see that in the course of the history all the time coming back, Trump's policy towards China, but it's not only Trump, it was continued by Biden. But you see it especially in the way the US is spending on the military. It's far now. It's representing more than 1/3 of what the world is spending militarily, and soon it will be much, much, much more. And so and they use it and they need it for this kind of dominant imperialist policy. What I think is the difference with his predecessors is maybe his style, of course. Not only is his style, he's unpredictable and he is very transactional also in his policies. And this is something which is creating more and more nervousness in Europe. That an ally is bullying his NATO partners. That's something that's not done in the eyes of many of European leaders, although, it has always been like that the US is leading NATO, is the leading nation, and is essentially setting out a part of NATO. We have seen how US was, taking the lead on the policy towards Russia, expanding NATO, also how they dealt with Ukraine, even in the months before the Russian invasion started. So, and Europe was like on the sidelines, although it happened all in Europe. And so this was not the difference. But the difference is the style. And I think what is remarkable in Trump's style is that he doesn't look for legitimations on his actions. He is bluntly saying, this is what I want to do. And he doesn't say there are weapons of mass destruction like they said in Iraq, or whatever arguments they use to intervene military or to have sanctions on a certain country. He just says bluntly, I don't agree with them, and I will attack them or I will sanction them. I will put tariffs, barriers, and so on trade, things like that, And so this is his style. And of course, his other thing is also remarkable is that he is really neglective and skeptical about, to say it prudently, about multilateral institutions. And that's what you have said, Ivana. the whole thing about the board of peace, which was supposed to be for Gaza, now it seems to be something general. And he is the president of it, and he is saying who can be on the board and not. This kind of, it's unbelievable that we witness such a kind of leadership in the US, but it's happening. And this is, of course, the very big difference with all the predecessors. And so he's very aggressive and transactional and blunt in the way he is acting in his foreign policies in general. Thank you.
Amy, if I could add just one sentence. He said when asked about international law and respect for international law, he said he was guided by his own morality. I mean, this is just like, this is a whole new level of disregard for international law, right? So
yeah,
it's
and we know his morality.
Yeah, no, of course. But yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Sorry.
Thanks, no worries. And Sophie, what are your thoughts on kind of the impact of the Trump presidency on the kind of threat of nuclear war?
Well, I think that he's just saying out loud what the US approach has been, for decades and decades. And I think that we have to remember that it was, it's the US that has, the only country that has used nuclear weapons in war, and how it chose to do that. There was overwhelming evidence that Japan was trying to surrender, but the US used, nuclear weapons against that country in order to make sure that it came out of the Second World War as the preeminent power in the world. Absolutely brutal war crime carried out against the Japanese people, but that's what the US did. And so I think that it's not like Trump's sort of any more brutal than that. I just think that, as people have said, he kind of is sort of more explicit about it. And that's what's going on. And I think that's why you're having a greater level of kind of opposition to him. The sort of the splits around NATO, they're taking place publicly, as opposed to sort of, behind closed doors. And people have said it's very much now, and I think this is because of the global situation. The global situation is sort of changing rapidly. The US is no longer, the economic superpower. You know what I mean? China has surpassed it economically. We know that the BRICS economies, the global South economies, have far, surpassed the G7 economies. And that's been for a considerable period of time. So there is a sense of urgency that the US has got to reassert its dominance over the world, because otherwise it's kind of lost its place. And I think that is what is characterizing sort of Trump's apparent kind of recklessness, this kind of acceleration. But it's all laid out in the US national security strategy, that the US has to, in order to reassert its dominance, it's got to sort of grab all of the world's resources, and exploit those countries in order to kind of increase its wealth, to reassert itself. That's the first point. But the second point is, and this is sort of central, is it is still the most kind of militarily sort of powerful country in the world. Do you know what I mean? That is where it still is definitely dominant. And so the risk, and this is where the nuclear risk comes in, is that the US is more and more prepared to move things from a kind of economic sort of like battle to a kind of onto the sort of the military sphere. And this again is like explicit in the national security strategy. When it comes to China, it says that its nuclear preeminence is absolutely critical in terms of having a confrontation with China, which is what it plans to do in order to contain China. As I say, given that the US has used nuclear weapons before, that threat is very, very sort of serious. But I would repeat that, because he is so explicit in terms of this like total venal self-interest of the US here, it's, as I say, it's all stick, it's no carrot now, that it's much harder for those US allies to be able to kind of defend that. You know what I mean? To defend that and sell it to their populations. So here in Britain, you know what I mean? Like there's, much greater level of opposition to the US special relationship and to the US military alliance, which is, being challenged a lot more. So, it's a very kind of contradictory situation. And also, things are kind of shifting globally in, quite a sort of fast way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, things are moving very, very fast. Ivana, I just wanted to go back to just ask you a bit more about the kind of dynamic between the US and Russia. So you mentioned that the New START treaty expired earlier this month, and I guess there's been quite a long history of missed opportunities as well as kind of progress on cooperation between the US and Russia when it comes to nuclear weapons. Could you just explain a little bit more about this dynamic and about how we're seeing it play out today?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in 1986, we reached the peak in nuclear arsenals, primarily driven by the United States and the Soviet Union. At that time, depending on how you count, it was somewhere around 60 to 70,000 nuclear warheads. That same year, Gorbachev and Reagan met in Reykjavik in Iceland, and actually got, historians describe this as getting within a hair's breadth of having an agreement to eliminate nuclear weapons. I mean, this is just, it's sort of, it's hard to believe we're 40 years past that, still really harping on this question. And I'll say two things about where each of those two leaders, Reagan came into office being sort of as militaristic as they come, and actually being swayed. Of course, the public opinion at that time, the public awareness in the United States in the 80s was huge. In 1982, 1 million people marched in Central Park, the Central Park rally against the nuclear arms race. That didn't impact Reagan. What impacted him was a film in 1983, that same year that this Stanislav Petrov story occurred and Abel Archer occurred, all these, horrible things were going on. He watched the movie the day after and was like, I need to do something about nuclear weapons. So that was Reagan. And then Gorbachev was actually really moved by US general public opinion, and what the US general public was doing, and thought that maybe I can make a deal with these people, right? Because there are some of them seem to be sane. And so we got to the point where they didn't agree to eliminate nuclear weapons, but we began kind of a series of agreements that reduced these numbers again to globally now about 12,500 nuclear warheads, nearly 90% of that still in the possession of US and Russia. And that, Obama was the president who gave an inspiring speech in Prague talking about a world free of nuclear weapons, and yet, basically set up the plans for US modernization of the nuclear arsenals. Obama did in 2010 negotiate with the Russians, the Russian President Medvedev at the time, the New START treaty. That brought down the number of deployed nuclear warheads to 1550, put limits on delivery vehicles, and so on. That agreement lasted for 10 years. And then in 2021, it was extended under Biden again for another 5 years, really with the goal of getting to a replacement agreement that would bring those numbers down even further, because you really don't need thousands of nuclear warheads. Even if you believe in deterrence, you absolutely do not need those numbers. And I mean, in 2022, once the war started in Ukraine, you sort of lost that ability under Biden. Trump came in, the war was going to end. And now, what Trump, in my mind, seems to be hiding behind, rather than discussing how we're going to have either an extension or a replacement agreement between the US and Russia, he now seems to be hiding behind the fact that he wants an agreement between Russia, China, and the United States. China has, in no uncertain terms, said that they are not willing to enter that conversation. as long as the US and Russia have, nearly 10 times greater arsenals than what the arsenal that China has. And if you ask me, I think that's a very reasonable position. I think we really are in a place where the first step towards, let's use Donald Trump's term, denuclearization, is US and Russia going down from 5,500 about, nuclear warheads each to something like 1,000. Then you can begin to engage with those who have on the order of hundreds of nuclear warheads. So that's where we are. And I think my impression is the Russians are ready for these conversations with the United States. The Chinese want those conversations to happen before they get involved. And then the US just seems to be like going off the rails. There's an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal from just a couple of days ago by Senator Tom Cotton, who's not just talking about putting more warheads on missiles, and sort of increasing our arsenal, speeding up our modernization, and then resuming nuclear testing. So it's like a whole new, it's not just a new nuclear arms race in terms of numbers, it's like a whole new, calling it a Cold War doesn't even seem to do it justice. It's just extremely, extremely dangerous. And yet it's the three countries we've been talking about, plus six others who have nuclear weapons, who also can all actually contribute to, an apocalyptic nuclear war, or at least start the chain reaction for an apocalyptic nuclear war. So we're really not in a good place.
Thanks, Ivana. And Ludo, I was just going to ask you a little bit about kind of what's going on in Europe and how much influence does the US have on nuclear weapons policy of European countries, as well as NATO, and what that kind of influence looks like.
Yeah, well, you cannot say really, although there are like 7 countries, European NATO countries with nuclear arms on their soil, you cannot really say there is a kind of European nuclear weapons policy. There is a nuclear weapons policy by France. They are quite independent, they are not part of the nuclear planning group of NATO. And you have the UK, but they are part of NATO, and they are very dependent technically with the Trident system, relying on the technically on the systems and so forth of the United States. And so the other nuclear weapons on the soil of Europe is connected to the NATO's nuclear sharing policy. And, this is essentially a US thing, let's say. When they were deployed in the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, we don't really know all the details about it, because still, if you ask a government in parliament, or somebody from government in parliament in Belgium, and I think it's in other countries as well, the same, and you ask them about nuclear weapons on the European soil, they will say we can neither deny nor confirm their presence. So it's a very strange, stupid situation that closes the debate on nuclear arms in Europe, especially those on nuclear sharing, And so we have nuclear weapons in my country, for example. We don't know the amount of it. We are not officially updated about the type of weapons, although we know from literature now that they have been replaced. And this was a US decision by B-6112 tactical weapons, nuclear bombs, and that need to be transported by new planes. And these are the Lockheed F-35. So it's a US thing, although it's Belgian pilots, Dutch pilots, Italian pilots, Germans and German pilots that have to transport them. And only in Turkey, the situation is different. They don't trust really the government of Erdogan, I think, to transport them themselves. But this is the only, let's say, and it's like the US that has also, how you say, the power to open the access codes, to make them ready for delivery in times of war. So it's mainly a US thing. The only thing, of course, is gradually, and this is to sell it, let's say, with the establishment of the nuclear planning group, which happened in 1966. then the policy of, and it was mainly due also to the mass demonstrations that came up in the end of the 70s and the 80s. It was what you can call the collectivization of these nuclear arms, US arms, to make them NATO. And this was, on the one hand, to legitimize the huge costs, that you invest in these nuclear arms. So for the United States, but also for the delivery, because Belgium bought these F-35s. If you protest, then they say, yeah, but this is for NATO solidarity, We need them because the nuclear arms are a sharing task with other NATO countries. So this is an investment in solidarity, let's say. And also, if you oppose this policy, you can, then it's translated as, if you oppose nuclear policy, and it's a NATO thing, then you in opposition with NATO military doctrines, and then you are in opposition with NATO and with the defense of NATO by adversaries like Russia now. So this is the game that is played on nuclear arms. But let's say that the US, of course, is totally in control. Let's say in in controlling these nuclear weapons, and that Europe is like, or these European countries that are sharing these bombs are just like executors of this policy.
Thanks, Ludo. And Ivana, I wanted to ask you about the nuclear deterrence that the US offers to its NATO allies, as well as to its allies in the Pacific, Japan, Australia, South Korea. What does this actually mean in practice? Like practically, what does this actually mean?
Well, as we heard from Ludo, 5 European countries have nuclear weapons, and as Sophie alluded to, the UK has both US nuclear weapons and also and you alluded to also relies on the US for actually making its own nuclear weapons functional in terms of the missiles needed to deliver them. The five, just to repeat, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, and Turkey. Back in the day, I think in the 80s, there were 7,000 US nuclear warheads on the European continent. It's now maybe estimated at about 100, but as Ludo said, not known exactly. It's a huge improvement from 7,000, but in my mind, I often think, Ludo, I apologize, but I often think about Belgium and think that Belgium has as many weapons as you'd need to destroy all of Belgium. So it's probably not a good idea to have them. I mean, it's just crazy. I think one of the things that was really quite striking in 2023, Russia sent some of its nuclear warheads to Belarus, and the US protested, against such a violation of the NPT. Biden, criticized this move. Instead of saying, oh, yeah, Russia, you're right. We also have nuclear warheads in 5 European countries. We'll remove them, and, you shouldn't go ahead and put yours in Belarus. No, of course not. The hubris, the double standard, all of this. And I completely agree with Ludo. These weapons are not making those countries safer. They're just making them a target. Belgium may be, particularly small, but all of Europe is a really, like, if you take a globe and look at the European continent, it is the piece of Eurasia that we call Europe. It's tiny, and in any kind of nuclear war, it's almost certainly the first. It's almost certainly one of the first victims. It is. I think this is where we have this other double narrative, that the fact that we give other countries our nuclear weapons has actually stopped proliferation, right? So that's the other kind of excuse that's being used. Oh, if we don't give them our nuclear weapons, they'll build their own. Um, all of it is really insane. All of it is extremely dangerous. We need to move towards a different way of thinking about security. In fact, it's not even that we need to reinvent something. We need to all read the UN Charter and then read it again and then respect it and think about how to, behave according to the UN Charter. It's a beautiful document. And yes, there are countries that have been able to really not to kind of live up to the promise of the UN Charter. Costa Rica, for example, gave up its military after 1945. It's gone to the ICJ when it had, conflicts with its neighbors instead of gone to war. I mean, this is the world we need to head towards, not just to avoid nuclear annihilation, which I think that risk is really real, but to also solve some of the many other problems we have on the planet. So yeah, no, it's a long-standing thing, and I do think it needs to go. I personally I think it's a violation of the NPT. Um, uh, but of course, the US, because it maintains control over the weapons, has maintained that it's not a violation of the NPT. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. And just to let everyone know, NPT means Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. It's one of
Thank
the
you.
many kind of treaties that we've been talking about. I'm going to move to questions quite soon, but before I do that, I wanted to ask all of you, and I asked this to Dae-Han Song as well, and his answer will be on the podcast. But I wanted to ask all of you, if you were put in charge of the US today, what would be the first thing that you would do to work towards a nuclear-free world? And I'm going to start with you, Sophie.
Well, it's easy, isn't it? I just withdraw all our, all our all the US nuclear weapons from all the countries where they're currently based. Just following on from what Ivana was saying. So that would be the first thing. And then to agree, sign up to extend START and to disarm its nuclear weapons. There we go.
Thanks. Ludo, any thoughts? What would you do?
Yes, if I would be the president, imagine. Well, I would, I think it's stepwise. I would work, of course, towards a nuclear-free world, and the first step is reestablish those agreements that have been suspended or abolished. And there are two very important bilateral agreements. The one is, of course, the one Ivana talked about, a new start about the strategic weapons, ballistic missiles launched from bases somewhere through the space or from submarines. We really need this because the door is open and there is a capacity, to easily expand nuclear arsenals. There was a report, I forgot the name of the organization, that proved that in short term they can be expanded again. So this is a very dangerous situation, and we need this new agreement. And the other one that has been suspended by Trump in his first term, that is the INF Treaty. This was also a very important treaty for Europe because it prohibited the tactical weapons, the short and middle range missiles. And this treaty has been negotiated by Reagan and Gorbachev when they declared, and this is a very important declaration, never a nuclear war should never be fought because it cannot be won. It should never be fought out. So this was their motivation to negotiate this agreement for Europe, and as a result, only after a few years, as these missiles have been deployed, including included in my country, the cruise missiles, and there was also the Pershing II. They were retreated again and dismantled. So this is something, history proves that this is possible. And then I think we should also reach out to China. China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arms, and we can understand that because they have not the same level of amount of nuclear arms as Russia has or the United States has. So they want to, let's say, to balance that. But as long, as there is not really a will by those both countries, Russia and the United States, to decrease their military arsenals, China will not feel the incentives to do the same or to stop their expansion of nuclear arms. And last but not least, I think this is nuclear arm disarmament goes together with, let's say, geopolitically, with what I forgot his name, but a friend from South Korea said, this idea of inclusive security, common security, to rebuild trust among nations. And so you need like a general disarmament, demilitarization sphere, let's say, connected to re-emphasizing the need of a multilateral institutions that talk about diplomacy, that works on confidence building measures and things like that. These are let's say the conditions we need for nuclear disarmament. And last but not least, that means that we can maybe finally be on the path again. And that will take a few years, I think, once we start with that, to prohibit the nuclear weapons. There is a treaty, only good 90 countries are member of it, the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this is the only solution, I think, to get rid of one of the two planetary threats, climate change and nuclear arms. That's just political will. Every country signs it, and every country engages itself to dismantle all its nuclear arms. And so we are rid of one of those two planetary threats.
Thanks, Ludo. And Ivana, I guess you probably got the most chance of actually becoming US president out of all of us. So what would you do?
I don't have any. I am a US citizen, but I wasn't born in the United States. So I'm out of luck on that one. And that's the only reason why I won't become president of the United States. I love all the suggestions. I would put them all as tied for first place, for first thing to do on behalf of a US president. When I speak with US audiences, actually had a chance to speak on the Tucker Carlson podcast. And so I was aiming for a somewhat different audience. I often talk about precisely what Sophie was referring to earlier with the war crimes committed, that the US committed in attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but of course more than just that, but certainly those. And this moral responsibility that the US has to lead the world on disarmament. We want to lead the world on all kinds of things. Well, why don't we lead the world on nuclear disarmament? Because we're the first country to develop these weapons. We're the only country to ever use them on cities full of women and children. And we also wrote the playbook for the nuclear testing era, during which we've had over 2,000 explosions that have had really devastating consequences. In places around the world, locally, but also global consequences as well. But there's a different piece of looking at this if you were a US president, recognizing that I actually really contend that the US has the most to gain from a world free of nuclear weapons. Who's going to attack the United States in a world in which there are no nuclear weapons? We've got the oceans, we've got the conventional military. Today, the US is vulnerable not just to its peer or near peer adversaries, Russia and China. It's vulnerable to North Korea. North Korea has on the order of 50 to 60 nuclear warheads. It has delivery vehicles that can reach every part of the United States. This country would be destroyed and it doesn't matter that we can destroy North Korea in turn. The United States can be destroyed by a relatively small, relatively poor country because nuclear weapons exist. So I think it is absolutely in the US, just forget the moral responsibility. It is absolutely in the US's national interest to work towards a world free of nuclear weapons. I'm really glad that Ludo brought up the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I'm actually a member of the scientific advisory group to the treaty, so this is definitely something that I work on and care about deeply. I see it as both the first and the last step in kind of that journey towards a world free of nuclear weapons. First, in the sense that it establishes the norm, it establishes the expectations, it establishes a common understanding that we really need a world free of nuclear weapons. And the last step, in that whatever has to happen between the nuclear armed states in the meantime, we will never again have a different international agreement that brings all the UN member states together on this topic that specifically bans nuclear weapons. This is it. It's not going to be another one. So we just have to see its importance in kind of both setting the path and really being that last piece that is going to be necessary to ensure our survival. I would just add one more thing, and that is that we also have to keep in mind the importance of addressing the conflicts that are currently happening, and preventing more conflicts from happening, for the obvious reason that people should not be murdered, in the 21st century. I mean, it's just also barbaric, but also because these conflicts, when they involve directly or indirectly nuclear armed states, really can lead to some kind of escalation that ends up either by accident or miscalculation or deliberately to a nuclear war. And so to sort of reduce the threat, reduce the risk of nuclear war, we also just have to address the conventional wars, and speak for peace as well, which I know everyone here advocates for and works on. So thank you.
Thanks, Ivana. And there was actually a question earlier on in the chat about Iran. Obviously, there's been a lot happening in recent weeks. And the question was, with the US threatening to attack Iran, does this create a legitimately serious risk of nuclear weapons being involved at some point? And I guess also recently we've seen kind of the talks that have been happening, and the Iranian foreign minister calling for full disarmament. So, Sophie, I wondered if you had any thoughts on what's been happening with Iran and the US.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's absolutely horrifying what we're seeing, this huge military buildup in the region yet again. And of course, if the US and or Israel were to attack Iran has made absolutely clear that it would retaliate. And so you could have a situation where Iran is targeting US bases across the Middle East. And so you could have a situation where you have like an absolutely devastating conflict, right across that region that would, put at risk hundreds of millions of people's lives. And then, of course, I mean, it's like the height of nuclear hypocrisy what's going on in relation to the targeting of Iran, because like other people have said, like I think Ludo, but others, in terms of there has been a huge amount of really, really important work within the international community to try and resolve the sort of the tensions and the concerns around Iran potentially developing nuclear weapons, which was it was a joint comprehensive plan of action. Yeah, very long, boring title. But basically, what that was very carefully put together by the UN Security Council, which was a system of inspections, program of Iran reducing its nuclear uranium enrichment, and in return, the US would lift the crippling sanctions on that country. And this was set up in 2015. By 2018, it was clear that Iran had complied with all of those, issues. So in terms of it reduced its uranium enrichment, it let International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors in. That was all fine. And then the Trump administration, Trump just walked out and so basically said, we're not going to uphold our end of the bargain. We're not going to lift the sanctions. And so, if the US administration really had wanted to, make sure that it was absolutely clear and they had absolute confidence that that Iran was not going to develop nuclear weapons, that would have been the moment. And they didn't do it. They just totally trashed it. And so I think, what we're seeing is a kind of persecution of Iran, really, who has said, repeatedly that it does not have, it's not developing nuclear weapons. And certainly, the International Atomic Energy Agency says it doesn't have any evidence of that. You now have a situation where Iran, having been bombed illegally by both Israel and the US, are saying that they are happy for inspections of their nuclear facilities to happen again. Okay. And then on the other hand, you have Israel, which is a nuclear state, totally failed to sign up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, totally refuses to have any, inspections of its nuclear facilities. No pressure put on this country, do you know what I mean, to kind of disarm its nuclear weapons. So I think really what's going on is this whole issue around, Iran's, nuclear threat supposedly is a kind of a sort of false flag, really, and it's a way to kind of justify the US's plans for regime change of that country, and justification for a kind of illegal bombing campaign. So I think in terms of could there be a threat of nuclear weapons being used? Well, yes, Israel have those nuclear weapons. Yes, the US has nuclear weapons. So yes, there is definitely a threat, but also there's a kind of wider threat in terms of, a conventional war that could then escalate, into, a global war. So yeah, it is a very dangerous situation. And, certainly here in Britain, we're kind of, putting pressure on the British government, to totally oppose this, not to allow the use of the Diego Garcia base, which Britain has joint control over, and to sort of condemn any kind of attacks.
Thanks, Sophie. Yes, Ludo. Yeah.
Maybe I can add to it. I think what is dangerous is also, of course, the maximalist agenda that has been pushed forward, I think, by Israel. We have seen both countries cooperating last year in June when they attacked certain installations and also leaders of Iran together. And when Iran responded by launching missiles towards Israel, and it created quite a damage in Israel, and that's why it's not only anymore this pressure on Iran on uranium enrichment and the developing of a nuclear program, but it's also about dismantling its ballistic missiles and also breaking away or stop supporting Hamas and Hezbollah. And essentially, it's about regime change. But the only thing, of course, and that's another danger apart from possible nuclear dangers, is that we have seen before that it's easy, baby, to change a regime. And I think I support the Iranian people to get rid of this regime, of course, but it should be done by the people and not by a military intervention. And this we have seen in Iraq before, in Afghanistan, in Libya, what happens. It's easy to change a regime as they did in Afghanistan, in 2001. Very easy and very fast. But the war lasted 20 years, and those who were driven from power in Afghanistan came back in 2021. Or in Iraq, where a military intervention created huge destabilizations, and Islamic State came out of it, essentially, out of these ruins in Iraq. And you see today still that Libya has not one, but two or three governments even, and is still unstable due to these military interventions. And that after Libya, there was a war in Mali. And so you have these destabilizing consequences of this kind of threat. So I hope it won't be even if I support the Iranian people, and even if many Iranians probably would support such a military intervention, I think it's a very, very dangerous path and can have very destabilizing effects for the whole Middle East.
Thanks, Ludo. And Ivana, do you have any brief thoughts on kind of what's been happening between the US and Iran?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I find that this whole thing and focus on Iran and of course the very serious risks that are involved in what happened last year and what could still happen in the coming weeks and months. Some of it really feels like the height of hypocrisy. As we just discussed, the US has this sort of moral responsibility for having brought nuclear weapons into the world, and so lecturing others about nuclear weapons and really for decades, because in my opinion, if Iran had wanted to acquire nuclear weapons, they really could have done it a long time ago. The other piece here, of course, is Israel, which isn't just one of 9 nuclear armed states. It's also the only one that maintains this policy of ambiguity and doesn't openly declare. It isn't just not a party to the NPT. It has a whole other special status of they don't talk about their nuclear weapons. And so for them to have nuclear weapons, not talk about nuclear weapons, but then, be attacking Iran, which doesn't have nuclear weapons and says doesn't want to have them, the whole thing is just really kind of, in my mind, really very, very twisted. The other irony here is that really keeping JCPOA could have achieved a lot more if your goal were really just that Iran doesn't acquire nuclear weapons. JCPOA would have been much more successful at that than kind of where we are with the tearing down of the agreement and this constant threat of military intervention, including what happened last year with the attacks on the nuclear sites. And the third thing is really this irony about that I referred to earlier, this notion that you're going to continue to talk about nuclear deterrence as this sacred policy that keeps you safe and secure at the same time that you tell others they can't have nuclear weapons. It's just not sustainable in the long term. And this is part of what's made things so challenging for the NPT. The NPT was not, the title is Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it has these 3 pillars, including disarmament. And it's the fact that we haven't in more than 55 years, haven't made enough progress on disarmament that has really led to these, proliferation pressures. And so I think that's that's something the nuclear weapon states really need to address by saying these weapons threaten all of us. We got to get to a point where we disarm rather than holding on to them and just telling others not to acquire them.
Thanks, Ivana. And just kind of before we start wrapping up, there was a question: is the nuclear arms industry in the US simply too powerful to stop? I wonder, yeah, Ivana, if you have any thoughts on that question.
I think it's the military, industrial, congressional, academic, whatever complex. Again, this book, The $1 trillion War Machine, it was just, of course, I knew all of this was going on, but reading it documented in such detail was really eye-opening. Nuclear weapons are a piece of that. So, I think there's plenty that they can do and plenty of money they can extract by dealing with other things. Obviously, we went down in terms of the number of warheads, so some of that is there. I also think that's, these corporations don't exist to make nuclear weapons. They exist to make money. And so there are ways of, divesting, there are ways of putting pressure on them to move away. I think this is obviously entangled with the military industrial complex, but I think it's much more about how you think about how you think and behave in the world in terms of what you whether your goal is to be a hegemon or your goal is to be a respectful partner to fellow UN member states. And so I'm optimistic that we can push some of those pressures, economic pressures aside. Not optimistic we'll get rid of the entire trillion-dollar war machine. But maybe if we get rid of the nuclear weapons piece, at least we can get rid of this, cloud hanging over humanity that at any moment we could literally, like, in less than our conversation has lasted here, we could like literally destroy the world. So that I think is really a key goal here.
Thank you so much. And before we wrap up, I'm just going to ask each of you if you have any final thoughts, just kind of minute or so. Sophie, I'm going to come to you first. Is there anything you want to leave us on?
Well, just to say, it's been really fascinating. I mean, I've often like been on platforms with Ludo, so it's always wonderful to hear Ludo. But also, it's been really great to learn from Ivana as well. So thank you, and thank you again to New Internationalists for organising this with us. For me, I suppose it's the fact that it's always been public protest. It's literally been people like signing petitions, going out on demonstrations that has forced political leaders to step back from the nuclear brink. I mean, when people were talking about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, these names are just so terrible, aren't they? But like this very significant treaty that was signed between Reagan and Gorbachev, and like Reagan like had no inclination and no real desire to sign that treaty, but then to actually enact it, so to destroy all of those nuclear weapons. But it was because of the huge mobilizations of people across Europe, Western Europe, and in Britain, all of us, terrified that there was going to be a nuclear war, and we were going to be in the crosshairs, that forced those European leaders and British leaders to put pressure on Reagan to say, you actually need to enact this treaty because we have got huge pressure here from our population. So it's really important to remember that. And of course, the situation that we face now, now more than ever. And I feel that, whilst the situation is obviously getting, like far more dangerous, more and more people, especially young people, totally understand the seriousness of this. And so it's really important that we kind of seize every opportunity that we have to bring, more and more people into our movement, and to show, as people have said here, that, nuclear disarmament is in all of our interests.
Thanks, Sophie. Ludo, is there anything you want to finish on?
Yes, thank you. I think these kind of debates are very necessary, and I hope they can raise awareness about the situation we are in. We have the doomsday clock, as you started, with 85 seconds only. Never it was so close to midnight. It's a symbolic clock, of course, but it shows that even when the amount of nuclear arms decreased much since the 70s, that the danger increased of having a nuclear war. So this is very important. And what is worrying me is the current debate in Europe going on. This is part of this normalization that openly there are discussions about, like Germany, a general saying Germany needs its own nuclear arms, because of the discussions between Europe and the Trump administration. So they don't trust anymore the guarantees of a US nuclear deterrence. And so they don't talk about disarmament as a kind of alternative or get rid of it, this nuclear deterrence idea, but instead of that, seeking themselves nuclear arms. And so in the Munich conference, that is the yearly conference, security conference, Macron was offering again, and it was not the first time, a French nuclear deterrence. And Germany, the Chancellor Merz, he said, yeah, he admitted we are in discussions with the French about this kind of nuclear deterrence. And in a few weeks, Macron will deliver his speech about the new nuclear doctrine in France. And probably he will offer again, and this French umbrella, nuclear umbrella towards other countries. And in Scandinavia, for example, there is even talk about an own Scandinavian Nordic nuclear deterrent. So, there's many opportunities, let's say, when I go to the other side of it, that the issue of nuclear arms is coming on the forefront, making front pages. And at the same time, and this is what happened and what Sophie was referring to, this movement that was created, seeing these politicians talking openly about nuclear arms and having them, and so not even openly they say it. In Scandinavia, for example, there was an analyst saying, and then we get out of NPT. NPT has no value anymore, and then you open the door for proliferation worldwide. So these dangers, that people understand that these are the consequences and dangers of it, and this can rebuild this nuclear movement. Because honestly, I see it. I'm writing myself. Also wrote a book about nuclear arms and articles, and I see that. That the interest is much lower than when I write, for example, about Palestine. And so, and the movement is small, if you try to mobilize, we did many times efforts in Belgium in the last years, then you see, of course, you get not the amounts, for example, as you see in the solidarity movement. And hopefully what is happening now is, creating awareness among the people that we really need to reestablish this movement in as massive as it was in the 80s, to push and to pressure our politicians to be reasonable and to get rid of this dangerous threat of nuclear weapons.
Great, thanks. And Ivana, just if you have anything very, very brief you want to add. And then
yes, absolutely. No, I was in a meeting last week with a staffer from Senator Ed Markey's office who said something. We had a very good meeting discussing these issues, New START, other things, but said something to the effect that they just don't hear Senator Ed Markey works on these issues because he cares and he's been kind of a veteran of arms control for decades. But many of the other people in Congress are just utterly unaware, completely, and partly because their constituents aren't coming to them to talk about this. So I completely agree with Sophie and Ludo that we need to get to a much greater level of general public's awareness so that we can, and action and activity, so that we can actually move the elected officials. I'll just give the example. It wasn't just the 80s. We had a huge success in the 1960s, not just, getting to the NPT at the end of the decade, but earlier on, when President John F. Kennedy negotiated with his Russian counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, the partial test ban treaty. That also came about as a result of public pressure, with the realization of the devastating consequences the nuclear testing was having here, for example, in the United States and in other places like the Marshall Islands and Kiribati and so on, where nuclear weapons, Australia, where nuclear weapons were being tested in the atmosphere. And actually, the U.S. Senate had no interest in this treaty. And JFK went on a kind of public tour for 2 months, got the general public really excited about the treaty. And the senators, when the matter came to a vote, the senators voted 81 to 18 or 19, 81 in favor of the treaty. So, and that only came about because the general public understood the issues and really acted and protested and so on. So we just quite simply need to get back to a level of awareness that also leads to action and gets us away from the brink yet again.
Thank you. And thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. If you are in Britain, there is a really important national protest taking place on the 28th of February. Stop British Nuke Debts national demonstration at RAF Marham. There is more information on that, which from CND, which should be shared in the chat. But basically, the government has announced it's buying 12 nuclear-capable fighter jets, which is a significant expansion of its nuclear capabilities. And there is going to be a protest at Marham to say loud and clear that we want to stop this nuclear expansion and scrap Britain's nuclear weapons altogether. And yes, please do check out the work of CND and New Internationalist through our magazine and our podcast, The World Unspun. And thank you so much again to our panelists for joining us today and for all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. New Internationalist is available in print and digital editions globally. And as a special thank you, if you subscribe in February to any annual print subscription and put in the code welfare not warfare, we will start your subscription with a free copy of our current magazine on the new nuclear arms race. So when you get to the basket, put in the code welfare not warfare. Apply that coupon and it'll appear here as a free line, and we'll start you off with a copy of our print magazine on our special edition on the new nuclear arms race. Thank you.